Okay, so I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 11.1 office hours. Please feel free to throw any chats or questions or comments in the chat box if you have any. Additionally, I think you have the ability to unmute yourself, so feel free to unmute yourself as well. My name is Elizabeth Burnett. I am on the CIID and Generate team. Today on our agenda, we will be discussing the changes within 11.1, previewing 11.2, briefly looking at the release calendar, open it up to any open discussion, questions, comments that we have on 11.1. And then, as most of you know, just giving you all the QR code and link for our session survey feedback. Today, our two presenters will be Johnny Cunningham and Ruth Lett. I will let them introduce themselves quickly.
Hello, my name is Johnny Cunningham. I am an ETL developer, implementation specialist. I don't know about the specialist part, but I work with states to actually to install, generate, build ETLs, run migrations, do all the testing, all of that work. So.
Hello, I'm Ruth Lett. I am also an ETL developer and implementation specialist, though my focus tends to be more on the implementation side than some of the ETL development stuff within the Generate product. And all of the stuff that Johnny just said is the same kind of stuff that I work on as well.
And then Johnny, I think I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay. So opening up, it wasn't on the agenda, but we wanted to do a quick sort of call back to version 11. We had a couple of issues with that, and we wanted to go ahead and discuss those, get those out in the open. So we had two issues with the update. The first was a view that we were creating for version 11.1. And apparently it existed in a couple of states. So the way SQL works, if you try to create something that already exists, it throws an error. And that error will then stop the rest of the process from running. We didn't have it in our environment. We didn't have it in one of the environments for the states that was doing the soft launch for us. But we did have that in a couple of other states. That was a very quick, easy fix because we just went into the update code and just wrapped an if exists around it. So basically it checks to see if that view exists before it tries to create it. So that was a very easy one. The second one was a little more complex, and that's the reason we ended up pulling the release down for a couple of days. So I'm going to go into the weeds a little bit to hopefully explain this so that it makes sense. If you're somebody who does SQL every day, you'll understand this. If you're not, I'm hopefully going to describe this in a way that makes sense. What we did is we had the 5.3 schema. So the way all of the tables and the structure looked in version 5.3. And then we had the table and the table structures, everything for 11. And there are tools that you can run. Basically, you put the two side by side, the tool runs and compares them. And then it gives you code that will transform schema 1 into schema 2. So if you have like a table where a column changed, it creates the code to rename that column. So it does a lot of the work for us, so we don't manually have to code all that. I mean, if we had to manually code the changes in 11, it would be releasing next year sometime. So it creates all that code for us, and we put them together. We put the code side by side. And depending on the type of change you're making, sometimes you have to, like, you can lose the data in a table. So if that's the case, then we have to copy that data out, make the change, put the data back in. There are some changes you can make to a table that don't affect the data that's in that table. So that was the first thing we did when we did our initial, okay, 5.3 to 11, what's this going to look like, is we identified all of the tables that would have basically breaking changes so that we could make sure that we pulled that data out, stored it, did our changes, put the data back in. There was one table, fact organization counts. This is the one that was the issue. So that is a core table that we use for everything. It stores all of the district and school information, has all of that data in it. Our initial assessment was the changes that we're making in that table were minimal, and it would not require us to copy the data out. We could just make those changes directly into the table. So we had identified that as one we didn't need to do that with. When the automated code ran for the comparison of the schemas, it created a drop table create table. And we missed that. That's the easiest explanation. We missed it. We had identified it as one that wouldn't need to be dropped and recreated, but the automated code created it as a drop instead of just making the modifications. So for states that already have that have been with us for a little while, that have migrated data, that had data in that table, when you ran the update, it dropped the table, recreated it, you'd have the new table, but you would have lost your previous data that you had migrated from previous years or whatever. That was not something we could just quickly put a patch sort of into the release. That's the reason we had to pull the release down for a couple of days. And then we just modified the code so that it did not drop the table. It just did the renames for the couple of columns that changed, and that way you didn't lose the data that was in that table. So that's the reason the release had to come down for a day or so. While we did that, retested everything, reran all of the tests that we had for V11, and then did the exact same thing we did previously, push it out to our staging server, test it out there, make sure it all packaged up appropriately, updated appropriately. And then once we were comfortable that that worked, we opened the release back up. So we've had a couple of states do it since that point, and they've been successful. So we feel comfortable that that issue is resolved. That was the two issues that we ran into with version 11, and that's why there was a little bit of hiccup in getting that one updated. Does anybody have any questions about 11 before we move on to 11.1 or about the release? And I'm counting on other folks because I can't do the chat at the same time.
Johnny, there's nothing currently in the chat.
Okay. So if you do think of something or if you have a question, you can certainly ask, but we'll go ahead and move on to 11.1. So 11.1 has obviously a very quick turnaround from 11. It is focused primarily on assessments. And it is the file specifications listed there: 175, 178, 179, 185, 188, 189. And if you're aware, those file specifications actually changed for this school year, and that's the changes that we had to make on the generate side. We did not want to package that in 11 because this was a big enough thing that it kind of needed its own coding, its own testing, that sort of thing. Plus there was some metadata and stuff we needed in order to do that testing that was delayed a little bit. So basically the changes for assessments are going to be, now they are broken down by grade level. So for those of you, the EdFacts coordinators and those ones working really closely with assessments, you're already aware of this, but for everybody else, the assessments basically changed to where they're now grade level specific. So there's a set of assessments for grades 3 through 8, and then there's a set of assessments for 9 through 12. So we had to add that logic in that actually separates the assessments by grade level. And then the other piece is for the 9 through 12 assessments, there are 12 new assessment types. So we had to add all of those in, the permitted values, make sure the logic can handle those assessments and distribute them appropriately. We made a change to toggle. So toggle is the questions you answer so that we have your state specific information so that Generate can produce the submission files for you. And basically you add your assessments in there into toggle. We modified the toggle screen to actually have grade level be the first thing that you enter grade level was like the 4th or 5th thing on the little entry screen. It's now the first thing that you're going to enter. So when you select grade level, it then gives you the appropriate assessment types based on the grade level you selected. So that will now work in accordance with the changes. This sort of goes along with 11. So if you're familiar with the 11 changes, or if you joined us for that office hours, or you've started working on any of that, version 11, we made changes to the structure to generate up to CEDS, to get us in line with CDS version 11 and the data warehouse version 11. Well, assessments also has those changes as well, right? So now assessments is going to be caught up. So there's, I want to say in the assessment table, there's one column that changed its name. And in the assessment result table, and this is in staging, sorry. In the assessment result table, there are 4 columns that change names. And then there are 2 new columns added to staging assessment results. So it's not a big set of changes, but there are a few changes to that. So if you have existing assessment ETL, if you're a state that's already submitting assessments with Generate or have started working on it, there is going to be a little bit of an ETL change. The other thing is with the new assessment types and the new columns in staging assessment results, there's a little bit of modification required for your source system reference data mapping table. We have built that into this release. So if you have the mappings, it doesn't touch them. If you don't have the mappings in your current source system reference data table, it will add them with the default mapping, just CEDS value to CEDS value. But at least it puts all the rows in there, and then you can go in and make the modifications that you need to make for your state-specific values. So I think that covers everything for the assessment changes. And then for child count, there was an issue with creating the submission file in the 0 count logic. So we resolved that. We found that. And then for exiting, it didn't actually impact the creation of the submission files or the migration at all, but the header row in toggle for 2 of the assessment questions was actually reversed. So the header was over the wrong question for 2 of them. So that's the fix that's described there. We basically just switched it so that the header is appropriate for the question. Again, this was a quick turnaround, so there's not as much in this release. It was really focused on getting assessments out. Does anybody have any questions on the changes for assessments? Or want any more specific information on that? I don't see anything popping up in chat. So breaking it down a little further, this describes the UI change that I mentioned. So this is the new assessment screen, and you can see it starts with grade level. So when you select a grade level that is between 3 and 8, any of those, you would get the appropriate assessment types. If you select a grade between 9 and 12, you get the appropriate assessment types. And then the rest of it is the same as this was before. So, but that's an example of what the new UI part of the toggle looks like. And then general changes that don't really apply to a file specification or anything like that. We enhanced the source system reference data. We have a rollover script so that as you create all of these mappings and source system reference data, so if there's somebody in here who doesn't do the ETL work, source system reference data, that table, what that does is it takes the state-specific mappings for any code set and converts them to the appropriate CEDS value. So that way, whatever your specific values are in your state, they will all get converted to the CEDS standard. And then from that point, it's the same migration for everybody. Well, as you're working on a particular file, there might be 2 or 3 reference tables or 2 or 3 code sets that need to be converted. So you would go in and create the mapping. So you slowly build out that mapping table as you start working on more and more files. Well, they're year specific, right, in that table, because you could have a change to your code set, right? The code set values on your side could change. So for one school year, you might map a value. The one I always use is just a simple like male, female, right? You might have M and F, and then next year you've decided to change it. Now it's 1 and 2. So it's year specific. It can accommodate that. So it would show that MF was for last year, 1, 2 is for this year. But then as you build out that table, as you go to the new year, you have to have all of the mappings for that year. So if nothing changed, we have an automated rollover script. So when you run your first migration of the new year, whatever that happens, but usually it's going to be directory if you're working on directory, but it could be anything. When you run the first migration of the year, it looks at the source system reference data table and says, are there any entries for this new year? So let's say 2024, right? You're going to run your first migration for 2024. It would look and say, well, there are no entries, and it just rolls over everything from 2023. That way you don't have to go in and manually create mappings for each year as you progress and generate. It'll manually roll it over. Well, we modified that script to add a from and to-year parameter, because depending on what you have, it just gives you more flexibility in doing that rollover. So it gives you a little more control over it. And then while we were in there working on that, we also cleaned up the log entries that the source system reference data rollover script creates, because some of them, depending on what you were doing with the rollover script, were a little cryptic. So we just modified what the log entries, made them a little more readable and a little more simple. I mean, simple to understand what's happening in the process when you're looking at the log. So those were the general changes. Again, tight release window, so we didn't get to do as much with this one, but we were able to work on source system reference data some. And then for this, I'm going to turn it over to Ruth.
Thanks, Donnie. So releases of Generate are typically tied to a set of EdFacts reports. So we're trying to make sure that any changes that have been made in the file specification are represented in the Generate database. And the version 11.2 release is going to contain changes and enhancements for files that are due in January and February of 2024. As a lot of you probably are aware, with the EdFacts modernization efforts, a lot of those timelines have sort of shifted a little bit. So if you're not sure which files those are in the January and February timeframe, you can always check the data submission organizer or check with your EdFacts coordinator. But just briefly, it's going to be files like discipline, exiting, personnel, staff, Title III, homeless. Those are the kinds of files that are due. And then we have some tool enhancements that are planned. The Generate product development team is always kind of looking for new tools that we can make available to our state teams for migrating and testing data, just to make that process easier and go more smoothly. So currently we have planned one particular enhancement to the source system reference data table, and that's what Johnny was talking about earlier, that contains that mapping of source option set values to like the CIIDS standard option set values. So we're planning on building that out a little bit further for this particular release, so that it has the full set of mappings for every table needed for all of the EdFacts files that we work on. And then there may also be other tool enhancements. So as we're working through things, we'll determine whether or not we feel like it's ready for that release. And if we've determined that it is, then it would be included in the next office hours for that 11.2 release. And then this last thing is staging validation enhancements that we're working on. So this is a tool that already exists within the Generate database. And if you want to learn more about what that looks like and how to use it, there is some documentation on that in our Git book. But just very briefly, what this tool lets you do is it lets you run scripts to test against some business rules to flag anything that might cause downstream issues in your data migrations. And this is something that we've really been able to build out and develop more fully because of our partnership with some of our CIID state teams. So when we encounter new ideas or new data configurations in a state that impact the, sort of state quality of data that goes into the staging environment, or impact things that, like a new configuration that we've not seen before, we can build that out into the standard business rules, and then that's accessible to everyone that uses that tool. So it's really exciting. So we have a handful of sort of known enhancements and new business rules that we're planning to add into that tool for that release. And that's it. Johnny, let me know if I missed anything.
Okay, sorry. Click too many times. Okay. So in terms of a release schedule, so what we have prepared right now is, as you all know, in the past, 8-ish, 10-ish months, have released 5.2, 5.3, 11.0. We are planning on releasing 11.1 in the next week or so. And then I guess I left it off by accident, so that was my mistake. But we'll have 11.2 coming out in December. So we're targeting before the holiday season in December. Any questions or comments on the release calendar for right now?
Hey Liz, it's Dan. I just wanted to elevate Robin's question since you might not be able to see it. She asked when the 11.2 is going to be released and if it's going to affect the ETL checklist.
So Robin, yeah, like I said, it'll be we are planning for December for 11.2 and affect the ETL checklist. Which one? Like in general, any ETL checklists, or just a specific one are you thinking about?
She says any of them. I'm not sure if you can see the chat.
I saw that. So in 11.1, we are updating the assessment ETL checklist with all of the assessment edits. And then in 11.2, we will have edits to the energy one, and then I believe Title 1 and Title 3. But those are the only ETL checklist edits that we have planned right now. Any other questions about the releases? I don't know, Johnny, if we need to go into anything further about the Git book. I don't think there's anything new coming out of 11.0 or the release before.
There's nothing specific, but Ruth did mention this. So if you haven't checked it out, we have the new Git book location for the documentation. It's a lot cleaner. Things are linked together in a much more intuitive way. You can follow links to things, follow a path through some process that you're trying to discover. And then, like Ruth mentioned, we have for the different tools, staging validation, and the other tools that we have available. There are pages out there as well that will help you understand the tool, how it's used, how it might benefit you. So if you haven't checked it out, please do. And then if you have any comments on things you think we could improve with the Git book documentation, please let us know about that as well.
And then Sonali had a question. Do we need the 11.1 upgrade before creating assessment files? I would suggest yes, Sonali, if you plan on submitting the files via Generate.
Yes, you will.
Yeah.
Because there were actual changes to the file specification, and those changes are going to be reflected in 11.1. So you will need 11.1 to work on assessments.
Candy asks, so there will be an update to FS 037 in December, and it's due January 10th.
Candy, you got me on that one. I don't know if we have any changes specifically for 37. So if that file specification had changes, so I think that's part of like what we didn't describe. and I apologize because I didn't do that well in that slide. If the file specification has changes, we will make those changes as part of that release. If there aren't any, then there is nothing that changes. So you could start to work on a file before the December release if there were no changes to that file specification. That's what the December release is going to try to cover, all of anything that might have changed. I don't know if I answered your question or not, Candy. And I saw something pop up, chocolate almond.
Any specific questions outside of what we've added into chat? Okay. And so just a reminder for today, with each office hour, we provide a survey link. This helps us. We've used this to implement some changes within how we operate the office hours. So if you have time, I think it just takes 2 or 3 minutes to finish the survey. It's really helpful to us in making edits based off of all of your feedback.
Thanks, Liz. I just want to add there that we work with an external evaluator on CIID to ensure that your feedback remains confidential and anonymous. What that our evaluator, Judy Lee, provides us is an analysis of the data that you provide via the evaluation. Linda asked one final question.
So Linda said, I am new to my role. How do I know if this is being used in my state? Which state are you with, Linda? Virginia.
By this, are you talking about the staging validation rules, or are you talking about something else? Generate 11.0, she says.
I don't think Generate is being used in Virginia right now. But Linda, to validate, if you want to ask someone specific, I would suggest either your EdVax coordinator or your Part B data manager. In addition to that, I can follow up internally with our TA lead to see if she has heard something different. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Oh, I am the EdVax coordinator. Perfect. Then my guess would be no, especially if you are unsure. But I can validate. Okay, yeah, you use you submit using ESS. Okay. Yeah, so I don't think so. But like I said, let me follow up with our TA lead to see if she has heard something different from maybe some of your leadership, and I'll follow up with you. I'll send you an email.
And I was going to say really quickly too, if you're interested in seeing the documentation for the validation, Ruth added a link to chat. So before you log off, if you want to check that out, you can see the specific page we have for staging validations.
Okay. Well, I think that's everything that we had today. If there's no other questions or comments, then we can probably wrap up. Thank you all.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Johnny, Ruth, thank you. Take care.